Music in video games. It's a topic that I have a lot of interest in, and I've finally found the best way to put that interest into words. You see, dear Game Rant community, I have a piece of paper that says I know a lot about music. That's right, I'm a former music major, and someone who has studied quite a few pieces in my time. So, since I have an unquenchable thirst to talk about both video games and music, I thought it fitting to talk about what I consider to be the most important factors that go into creating a video game soundtrack. And I'll be throwing in some examples from games that I like particularly in this regard. Also, just a quick general spoiler warning, I'm not planning on going in depth with any major story details, but if you're avoiding spoilers for any of these games, I recommend addressing that before watching. And without further ado, I think it's time to begin. Now, technically, there are 8 elements of music that we would use for a traditional music analysis: dynamics, form, harmony, melody, rhythm, timbre, and tonality. The problem with these elements is, most likely, you, the person watching this, don't have a music degree or might not even have musical knowledge to begin with. That, and often these elements are used to describe singular pieces of music rather than entire soundtracks. And while I'm sure someone out there would really be interested in a 3-hour-long video going in depth on all 101 tracks in Undertale, I think we might be better off making a system of our own. So I thought long and hard about what, to me, are the most important elements of any good video game soundtrack, and here's what I've come up with: intensity, sound mixing, easy listening, thematic relevance, and variety. Is it the same music over and over again? Does it change things up enough to keep things fresh, but not so much that it feels disjointed? A lot of classic video games, at least in my opinion, fail in the variety department because oftentimes they had a very limited soundtrack with a handful of actual unique tracks. The original Legend of Zelda has this problem, but older games like that had limited storage space that meant that developers weren't going to waste megabytes, possibly even kilobytes, on just music. This meant that composers had to be economical with how much they actually wrote, and as a result, older soundtracks tended to be lesser in size. But something more modern is able to host a lot more music on it. With the increase in storage space available, games could now have a ton of different musical ideas on it, but that's not always a good thing. Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, one might say, has a lot of variety in the music it throws at the player, but like I said, more variety isn't always a good thing. Throughout the game, you listen to what you might expect from a typical Final Fantasy soundtrack, but also Frank Sinatra's My Way and the seminal genre known as butt rock. Oh, believe me, I could talk a lot about butt rock. This variety actually hurts the overall soundtrack because these inclusions feel completely out of left field in a Final Fantasy game. Although this game also gave the medieval princess an iPod Touch, and now I'm realizing there's probably a whole group of people who doesn't even know what an iPod Touch is. I'm sad now. If you want a good example of variety though, I would highly recommend Undertale. I'm sure most of you already know about this game to a certain extent, and if you don't, you should go play it. This game has so many different ideas both in terms of gameplay and themes that having just one aesthetic for the music would be out of place. As such, Toby Fox wrote a whopping 101 tracks, some of which are admittedly not songs, that all fit their specific moment. Listening to this soundtrack always brings something new to the table, much like the game, and despite the many different directions the game takes you, the soundtrack maintains a core identity. Every song feels at home with the overall story and themes of the game, while managing to ground itself in the moment. Even if you've never played this game from start to finish, you can still tell which tracks are bosses, which are meant to be atmospheric, and which ones are meant for comedic characters and moments. Variety is an essential element to any soundtrack, but you still have to maintain a core identity. Which leads nicely into our next element, thematic relevance. Does the sound match the story or setting? Does it match where the player is at in the gameplay or story? The music of Cyberpunk 2077 wouldn't exactly fit into Elden Ring. While both soundtracks are excellent in their own right, swapping them would eliminate the matching tone. After all, both are dystopian settings, but Cyberpunk has a vastly different attitude compared to that of Elden Ring. Also, not to harp on Stranger of Paradise again, but Frank Sinatra and the butt rock also fall under this category. These elements often have crossover, and this is one such example. Also, Frank Sinatra and the butt rock is the name of my first memoir. Vord of the Boreal Valley in Dark Souls 3 has one of the best boss themes in the entire game in my opinion, and is only the second boss you fight. Don't get me wrong, I love his theme. but I can't help but feel that it is really intense and epic for only the second boss. And thematically, Vort isn't a huge figure in the lore, at least as far as I'm aware, so it seems odd that he gets such a big sweeping theme compared to other bosses. Although I suppose you could also make the argument that his theme fits perfectly since he's the first real challenge you're faced with in the game. And we don't have to leave Dark Souls 3 to find some really great examples of thematic relevance. But before we do, I wanted to quickly bring in a term that'll be important for this element. There's a term often used in music and literary analysis called leitmotif, which is defined as a recurrent theme throughout a musical or literary composition associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. Every time Darth Vader comes on screen, the Imperial March starts playing. Every time Sephiroth shows up, One Winged Angel starts playing. Every time the Power Rangers use their ultimate attack on a monster, that season's theme song starts playing. There are infinitely more examples of this, but the long and short of it is if you associate a person, place, or thing with music, that's a leitmotif. And leitmotifs and thematic relevance are tied at the hip. Within Dark Souls 3, there are two bosses that I feel really bring out some awesome leitmotifs: Aldrich, Devourer of Gods, and Soul of Cinder. Aldrich is one of the Lords of Cinder you're tasked with slaying and bringing the ashes of back to Firelink Shrine. And he is one of the many examples of Dark Souls 3 calling back to, and sometimes explicitly referencing, previous Dark Souls games. In this case, you find him in Anor Londo, an area from Dark Souls 1, which has been greatly reduced from its former glory. Plus, looking at the design of Aldrich calls back to Dark Souls 1, with the half-eaten remains of Dark Sun Gwyndolin acting as Aldrich's upper body. Not just that, but the music that plays during his boss fight takes heavily from that of Gwyndolin's fight from DS1. And I guess also the Moonlight Butterfly, but that's less important. In a game meant to bring the entire Dark Souls story to a close, this is a great inclusion, but it pales in comparison to the final boss, Soul of Cinder. This is the amalgamation of every undead that has ever rekindled the first flame, meaning that it has a ton of skills and weapons to choose from. Once you reduce its health to 0 for the first time, the boss stands, focuses on its sword, and suddenly the music swells with a very familiar piano melody. The theme of Gwyn, the first one to rekindle the first flame, and the final boss of Dark Souls 1. This phase brings back his motif, his moveset, and wraps the story up in a satisfying manner. Dark Souls is a series all about cycles, and with this game representing the end of one, it's only fitting that the first Soul of Cinder is the one to end it all. This is what I'm looking for when I say thematic relevance. Something that enhances the existing aesthetic while tapping into the story and lore to draw connections between characters, events, and locations. Easy listening. Can you listen to this music over and over again? If I keep dying to this boss, am I getting annoyed by the soundtrack? Does it blend into the background when you're tuned out of it? If you're stuck in a hard boss fight playing the same level over and over again, or thinking something over in the menu, you want to be listening to something that won't distract or aggravate you. The first soundtrack that comes to mind, at least for me, is Balatro. That game has roughly 4 or 5 total tracks, and I could listen to all of them non-stop. The best soundtracks are the ones that have the ability to blend in when it matters. Obviously, in big moments you want music to uplift it, but during smaller moments like navigating the menu, hanging out in the main hub, or just walking through an area, the ability to fade into the background is an invaluable one. Music being catchy, or just appealing to the player, is also a great way to fit the easy listening mold. I could listen to the Devil May Cry soundtrack for hours on end, and it certainly does not fade into the background. Just by fitting its mold so perfectly, it manages to stand on its own without interrupting or disrupting the game it's in. Sound mixing. Sound mixing is one of the hardest elements to define because the best sound mixing is impossible to notice unless you know what to listen for. Meanwhile, the worst sound mixing is immediately noticeable and instantly throws players off. Perhaps the most infamous examples of awful sound mixing are some of the early 3D titles of Sonic the Hedgehog. The music and sound effects in these games are often too loud and as a result cover up the voice acting. Bad mixing also affects individual songs like the opening theme to Sonic Freeriders, which is a song that somehow is always too loud. And while an example like this is a bit flawed since it's not like it ruined a great game or anything, but in a franchise where music is often the highlight, this is a disappointment. If the music is too loud, then we can't hear anything. If it's too soft, then the soundscape sounds barren. As a rule, the most important sounds in a game are the voice acting and sound effects, especially if it's a game that communicates to its players through sound design. Sound mixing is an art, and those that can perfect it can create something truly special. Intensity. Does this music fit with what I'm doing? Does it shift in intensity between slower and faster-paced moments? Imagine, if you will, sitting down to play a chill session of Animal Crossing New Horizons, only to be greeted by the soundtrack of Doom Eternal. While I'm sure this wouldn't stop many of you, and just as many would find this deeply hilarious, it would still be equally shocking. Likewise, if Animal Crossing music replaced Mick Gordon's soundtrack. Intensity is our final element, and these two games that are more or less polar opposites are our examples. In Animal Crossing, your gameplay loop consists of managing your island, fishing, catching bugs, gathering resources, and trying to get the villagers you want on your island. In Doom, you're ripping and tearing until it's done and fighting through the entirety of Hell's army. Naturally, the soundtrack for these two games should have different levels of intensity. The game's music should communicate how the player should be reacting to what's going on, whether that's panic at a scary monster coming to get you, or the relaxing sound of spring as you plant your crops. The thing is, games don't just stick to one level of intensity throughout the entire thing, and if they do, it usually isn't very high. Picture a game like a car. If you put pedal to the metal for the entire ride, it can end up burning out if it goes for too long. Every game needs a moment of relative calm. Every level needs an ending, and if the game is constantly running at 100%, it can end up burning out the player. Be honest with yourself, if a game never stopped for even a second, not even one solitary moment for you to take a breath and collect your thoughts, it wouldn't be fun after a while. And the soundtrack has to reflect this fluctuating intensity. When the game expects you to slow down, explore, talk with some NPCs, solve some puzzles, the music is most likely slower and softer to give more room for thought. While big action set pieces will have dramatic and pulse-pounding tracks. Impactful character moments will have music that reflects the glory or tragedy of that moment. And the final credits should cement the feeling the player should leave the game with. Intensity is the ability to adjust to the energy and pacing the story wants to have in that moment, and when it's done right, it's unforgettable. This has been Game Rant's analysis of video game soundtracks. Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you have any soundtracks that you adore? Do you have any games you would want us to go in depth with? Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.